Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I thank the senator from Hawaii. First of all, I want to acknowledge my great appreciation for the work that you and your committee have done on bringing attention to the ongoing challenge that communities that have been hammered, like your community of Lahaina in my state of Vermont, from natural disasters. And I'm going to speak in support of the efforts you're making to get supplemental funding for the absolutely essential flexible funding that goes with the Block Grant Disaster Relief Fund. Thank you very, very much. You know, we are all in this together, and what Senator Schatz said about the formality of a federal disaster declaration, the formality is it's an acknowledgement that what happened through no fault of anybody in Hawaii, through no fault of anybody in Vermont, is beyond the capacity of the communities in Vermont and Hawaii, beyond the capacity of Vermont and beyond the capacity of Hawaii to handle the entire consequence of those events. And what is more important, more essential for the Senate than to acknowledge that all of us as Americans, there but for the grace of God goes our community when a natural disaster occurs. So we have to respond. There's two times that there's a response. One is in the immediate trauma of the event. It's all hands on deck. The community does everything it can, and there's one story after another in Lahaina, in Ludlow, Vermont, in Johnson, Vermont, of people coming together literally to save fellow citizens and neighbors, and oftentimes people they don't even know. And the federal government comes in. President Biden was immediately responsive in Vermont as he was in Lahaina. And our FEMA administration comes in and was immediately responsive. And that really helps. It really, really makes a difference. But you know what? This is a photograph of the capital of Montpelier right after the flood. It's totally inundated in water. Every business on Main Street was basically destroyed. And the immediate relief efforts are about the water going down, getting the mud out, trying to find some temporary place to live, see if you can save your business. But on that Main Street in Montpelier, our businesses are coming back, but they're not all back yet. And what I've seen is that the money that comes in right away and the help that comes in right away gives hope to folks. It gives all of the citizens in the state who are sad at what has happened to their neighbors, but who, by the grace of God, avoided their own home or their own business from being flooded. It gives them and me hope that those folks are going to get some help from the federal government, and they did. Our roads and bridges, we're putting them back together. Some of the water treatment facilities that were destroyed, we're putting some of those back together. But the reality is there is a long and lasting trauma and practical challenge of trying to get everybody back on their feet. You know, if it was, I get asked by my colleagues, and I really appreciate their concern, Peter, how is Vermont doing? And I don't quite know how to answer that, because on one level, Vermont's doing great. We've moved on. That flood in July, we've done the major things that have to be done. And the help we got from the federal government was really essential in doing that. And the good wishes from my colleagues, I am so grateful for. But the other part of that is when I'm asked, how is Vermont doing? The Vermonters, if it was your home, if it was your business, if it was your farm, you're not doing well. You know, it's a lot to try to put that business back together. It's a lot to look at that home and realize you may not be able to get back in. So let me just give an example. You know, I was in Barre, Vermont, that is about 5 miles from Montpelier. You're seeing that here. They got flooded, much like Montpelier did. In Montpelier, most of the damages was to businesses. In Barre, most of it was to homes. And the FEMA administrator, Chris Welch, joined me and Senator Sanders and Congresswoman Ballant, on a tour of homes. I returned in March, and the folks who came to our meeting and took a tour of Barre with me were a lot of the folks whose homes had been damaged. They're still trying to find out whether they can get bought out. They're still trying to find out whether they can get back in their home. One couple was at the home when I showed up. They weren't able to get back in. They're living in a mobile home about 50 miles from where their home is. And there's a lot of confusion about what you can do and how you can do it. Those thorny questions about what's available and how are you going to implement what's needed for that home or for that business. Those really linger. And at this point, FEMA's, I don't want to say they're gone because they've done what their job is. But the pain and the pain is still very present for those folks, your farm, your business, your home. And the challenges of getting through the bureaucracy are very complicated. And that's what I learned with the folks in Barre, who basically have a group of volunteers who've managed to stay together to try to address concerns and questions that various members of the community have. But the thing that is absolutely vital is the flexible funding that comes from the Disaster Relief Fund. You know, no matter how hard and how competent and how professional our FEMA folks are, the reality is they have to move on to the next disaster. That's what's happening in this country. But the pain in that community is behind, and it's the folks in the community who really have to have the capacity and the tools and the resources to do what only can be done by folks in Barre, in Montpelier, in Johnson, in Ludlow, in Weston. And I'm sure that's true in Lahaina. And of course, those are the best people to do the work. They live in that community. The most important thing to them is to restore the vitality of the community that they love. So the disaster relief funding is the absolutely essential component to allow the full rebuilding, the recovery for the folks who lost their homes, for those farmers whose crops have been wiped out, and for those businesses that are so vital not just to that individual business owner, but to that downtown community that depends on retail downtown so neighbors can come in, shop, see one another, and have a sense of community. So if we're going to have an effective disaster relief program, yes, it starts with the federal declaration. And our president and previous presidents, in my experience, have been very responsive to communities that, through no fault of their own, have suffered a devastating loss from a weather event or a fire, as was in the case of Lahaina. But what happens after the waters recede, after the FEMA emergency folks are gone, is that the hard work of actually rebuilding that house, repairing that business, that is left in the community. And if they don't have that disaster relief funding and the flexibility that's required to respond to the very particular challenges in that community, then we haven't completed the job. And it creates a sense of frustration and anguish and pain that we can alleviate by having a disaster relief response that starts when the event occurs. That's the disaster declaration, but continues until the job is done. And that's where the funding for the disaster relief is so absolutely essential for us in order to maintain the commitment that I believe this Senate has to help folks who have been on the receiving end of a catastrophic loss. So I am fully in support of the supplemental appropriation request that the senator from Hawaii is making, because my view, he speaks for all of us. In my view, there but for the grace of God goes your community. And we in Vermont, just as Senator Schatz in Hawaii, have always been there to support the funding for communities around this country that have suffered losses such as what happened in Hawaii and what happened in Vermont. thank the senator for organizing this, and I look forward to working with Senator Schatz and others in order to make sure we get that disaster relief funding and a supplemental appropriation. And I yield back.